Hello. This is supposed to be stamped this reading. This is supposed to be a reading of stamped chapter 2. You know, look at the first upload. Anyhow, that's what's supposed to be. The reason why it's done in Animal Jam is so there's no watermark from X Recorder. Anyway, let's get into the second chapter. Section 1, Chapter 2, Heretian Power. Okay, so by now, hopefully you're saying, wow, this isn't really like the history books I'm used to. And if you're saying that, well, you're a liar, and guess what? You wouldn't be the first. After Noam Enes de Ceruta's ridiculous money-grabbing lie, there were other European race theorists who followed suit, using his text as a jump-off point for their own concepts and racist ideas to justify the enslavement of Africans. Because if there's one thing we all know about humans is that most of us are followers, looking for something to be part of to make us feel better about our own selfishness. Or is that just me? Just me? Got it. Anyway, the followers came sniffing around, drumming up their own cock of me. Best word ever. Even better than possibly a synonym. Okay. Main theories, two of which would set off the table for the conversation between racism for centuries to come. Those theories were climate theory. This came from Aristotle, and we'll get back to him later, who questioned whether Africans were born this way or if the heat of the continent was made them inferior. Many agreed it was climate, and that if African people lived in cooler temperatures, they would, in fact, become white. And curse theory. In 1577, after noticing that inland people in northeastern region were darker than the people living in the south, English traveler-writer George Best determined conscientiously for all parties interested in owning slaves that it couldn't have been climate that made darker people inferior, and instead determined that African were in fact cursed. First of all, you could imagine someone on the channel telling you that you're cursed? Like, really? And what did Beast use to prove that theory? And what did Beast use? What did he use to prove this theory? Only one of the most influential books of the time, the Bible. At first, in Beast's whimsical interpretation of the book of Genesis, Noah ordered his white sons not to have sex with their wives on the ark, and then tells them that the first child born after the flood would inherit the earth. When the evil, tyrannical, and hypersexual Ham goes ham and has sex in the ark, God wills that Ham's descendants will be dark and disgusting, and the whole world will look at animals of trouble. Simply put, Ham's kids would be black and bad, ultimately making black bad. Curse theory would become the anchor of what would justify African slavery. It would branch off into another ridiculous idea, the strange concept that because Africans were cursed and because, according to the Indians, they needed enslavement in order to become saved and civilized. The relationship between slave and master was loving. It was more like parent and child, or minister and member, mentor-mentee. They were painting a conspirative picture about what was certainly a terrible experience, because, well, human beings were being forced to servitude, and there's no way to spin that into one happy family. But literature said otherwise. That's right, there was another piece of literature. Sure. This one, written by a man named William Perkins, called Ordering a Family, published in 1519, in which he argued that the slave was just part of a loving family unit that was ordered a particular way, and that the soul was the potential of the souls were equal not the skin. It's like saying I looked at my dog like I looked at my children, even though I trained my dog to fetch my paper by beating it and yanking it and its leash. But the idea of it all was that the new enslavers off the hook and betrayed them as do-gooders cleaning up the Africans. A generation later, slavery touched down in the newly colonized America, and the people there to usher it in, and more importantly, to use it to build their canoe country, were two men, each of whom saw himself as a similar kind of do-gooder. Their names? John Cotton and Richard Mather. About Cotton and Mather, they were Parisians. About Parisians, they were English Protestants who believed the reformation of the Church of England and was basically watering down Christianity, and they sought to regulate it to keep it more disciplined and rigid. So these two men, at different times, traveled across the Atlantic in search of new land, which would be Boston, where they could escape English persecution and preached their vision, a pure vision of Christianity. They landed in America after treacherous trips, especially Richard Mather, whose ship sailed into a storm in 1635 and almost collapsed with a massive rock in the ocean. Mather, of course, saw survival to this journey to America as a miracle, and became even more devoted to God. Both men were ministers. They bought churches in Massachusetts, but more important, they bought systems. The church wasn't just a place of worship. The church was a place of power and influence. And in this new land, John Cotton and Rich Mather had a lot of influence. And the first thing they did to spread the Christian way was find other people who were like-minded. And with those mind-like folks, they created schools to enforce higher education skewed towards their way of thinking. What school, do you think, was the first to get their Dutch? This is a tricky question, because the answer is the very first university in America. Ever. The study is brand new. And the very first university in America ever was Harvard University. But a tricky thing happens with the opening of Harvard. A thing that directly connects the two, and the curse and climate theories that everyone be talked about thus far. See, Cotton and Mather were students of Aristotle. And Aristotle, though held up as one of the greatest Greek officers of all time, famous for things we will not be discussing here because it's not a history book, believing something else and that is belief in human hierarchy. Aristotle believed that the Greeks were superior to non-Greeks. John Cotton and Mather took Aristotle's idea, because they two were followers, and flipped it into a new equation, substituting Persian for Greek. And because of their miraculous journeys across the Ragged Ocean, especially Richard Mather's, they believed that they're the chosen people, special in the eyes of God, Puritan superiority. According to the Puritans, they were better than Native Americans, Anglo-Saxon English people who weren't Puritans, everyone else who wasn't Puritan, and especially African people. And guess what they did during the development of Harvard? They made it so that Greeks and Latin texts could not be disputed, which meant Aristotle, a man who believed in human hierarchy and used climate to justify which humans were better, could not be disputed, and instead had to be taken as truth. And just like that, the groundwork was laid not only for slavery to be justified, but for it to be justified for a long, long time, simply because it was woven into the religious and educational systems of America. All that was needed to complete this oppressive puzzle was slaves. America at this time was like one of those games where you have to build a world, a social network of farmers and planters. If you weren't a farmer-planter, then you were a missionary. So you would either dirt folk or church folk, everyone working to grow on stolen land. Obviously, their neighbors weren't happy about any of this, because their world was being broken, while a new world being built, planted one seed at a time. That seed? Tobacco. A man named John Pori, a defender of curse theory, the cousin of one of the early major landowners. First thing he did was set the price of tobacco, seeing as it would be the country's cash crop. But if tobacco was really going to get money, if it was really going to be the natural source of power, But what they needed was some more human resource to grow it. See where this is going? In August 1619, a Spanish ship named the San Juan Batusca was hijacked by two ships. The Batusca that was carrying 350 Angoleans and because Latin American slaveholders had already figured their own slave trading system and have already enslaved 2,500,000 people. The pirates robbed the Bacusta, taking 60 of the Angoleans. They headed east, eventually coming upon the shores of Jamestown, Virginia. They sold 20 Angoleans to the cousin of John Pori, the one with all the land, who happened to be also the governor of Virginia. His name was George Yeardley, and those first 20 slaves for Yeardley and Pori were right on time to work. Remember, America was full of planters and missionaries, and the new slaves would cause a bit of conflict between the two. For the planter, the slaves were a big help and could be the four-digit code to the American ATM. Here comes the cash. On the flip side, missionaries coming down on the line of Puriation and Ceruta's propaganda felt slavery was a mean of salvation. Planters wanted to grow profits, while missionaries wanted to grow God's kingdom. No one cared what the enslaved wanted, which, to start, wouldn't been not to be enslaved. They didn't want the religion of their masters, then their masters resisted too. Enslavers were interested in hearing everything about converting their slaves. Saving their crops each year was more important than saving souls. It was harvest over humanity, and the excuses they gave to avoid backing slaves were Africans were too barbaric to be converted. Africans were Sabbath sold. Africans couldn't be loved even by God. End of chapter 2.